Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. The guest that we have on, he's been on a number of times, and every time he comes on, he's always bringing a topic that really puts a lot of things into perspective and makes you appreciate the world in which we live in. He always has surprises, and his latest book is just a continuation of that. But Tim, I would like to briefly continue this conversation by asking you how you're doing today.
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for asking. And yes, very excited to introduce this conversation with author James Renner. And James Renner is really no stranger to these airwaves, especially way back in the day when this podcast originally began back in 2015, 2016, those days, because we were all working on the disappearance of Maura Murray. But now, Lance, that is not the case with what James is doing, and he has written a new book. It is called Scout Camp: Sex, Death, and Secret Societies Inside the Boy Scouts of America. And this is James's new true crime book in which he writes in first person with a well-defined voice, and he really gets personal in this book.
This is definitely his most personal book. He goes into such explicit detail about abuses and secret rituals and secret societies in such a brave and, I guess, timely fashion. I mean, the back of the book literally says timely, brave, and deeply personal. So that's all you really need to know going into this, other than that's one of the most important things you need to know going into this. The other most important thing you need to know is this has many emotional triggers for anybody who might have been a victim of abuse in any situation. Emotional, physical, sexual, anything. Even if you're a recovering alcoholic, you will most likely see triggers in this book as well. And we talk about how unapologetic his writing style is. And this is just a shining, clear example of that. But a book that you really do need to read, as difficult as it might be.
Yeah, it's a really interesting book, and it dives into the Boy Scouts of America and really how there are, I guess, generations of people who are still grappling with sexual abuse that happened to them as children. But that's not to say everyone. But yeah, it is certainly an organization that is a bit confusing to me, especially as an outsider who's never had any experience with the Boy Scouts or anything like that. So it is definitely interesting to learn about that organization and Renner's history with it.
So after this conversation, be sure to stay tuned for what Tim and I have been doing at the end of each episode. We've been providing our final thoughts on the conversation and on the topic that we've discussed, because after we take a little bit and let it process in our own heads, we know that the listener probably has similar thoughts or questions. So we just want to address those at the end of the episode. And we've just been having a really good time doing that. So again, stay tuned for the end of the episode where we give some of our thoughts and opinions on this conversation. And if there's anyone listening who can relate to James's story and you would like to take further action on your own, you can go to survivingscouting.org. You can go to survivingscouting.org. Or if you have been the victim of sexual assault or know somebody who has, you can go to the National Sexual Assault Hotline, 1-800-56. You can call the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4673 or go to their website, rainn.org.
Okay, everybody, make sure to follow us on social media at Missing CSM. We're going to take a quick break for commercial, and we'll be right back with author James Renner. James Renner, welcome back to the podcast. How are you today?
Great. It's been a while. I have to write a new book to see you guys anymore. How you been?
Good. Lucky us that you feel the need to write a book so that we can talk, because your books are fantastic. And every time we do have you on to talk about your books, we need a little bit of extra time to process the topics that you write about, because the writing style that you have is so, I want to say something like unapologetic. So you don't when you are reading a James Renner book, you know you're reading a James Renner book, and you appreciate it. So hopefully you understand that that's a compliment. But
no, it is. I've also gotten a lot of criticism for that too. Specifically the unapologetic. But my hope, when I write these books, I'm as honest about myself as I am with anybody I'm writing about. So I hope that kind of balances things out for most readers.
Yeah, and I do have a question about that, but I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves. When you sent this particular book that is being released in February to us, I read the first 2 pages and I was like, oh my God. I mean, the first 2 or 3 pages is it just knocks you over. But anyway, I know that there's probably 1 or 2 people in the world who don't know who you are. So could you just give us a little bit of a background?
Yeah.
Because we go way back and I just assume that everyone knows.
So you might have seen me in the Broadway play Wicked. I was the Scarecrow for many years. No, my name is James Renner. I'm a journalist and author, probably best known for, better or worse, for the book True Crime Addict, about the disappearance of Maura Murray. But I've written a number of true crime books. I think this is my 6th true crime book, but I've also written a couple novels over the years. And before that, I was a journalist for Scene, which was our Village Voice newspaper here in Cleveland. And, I've kind of fallen into the true crime genre over the years. I've got a couple podcasts, True Crime This Week and The Philosophy of Crime, if you like that stuff. And yeah, the new book is called Scout Camp, and it's out February 25th, wherever you get your books. It'll be available as an audiobook as well, and I'll do there it is. I do the narration for that.
Very good. Well, yeah, as Lance mentioned, your writing style is sort of very defined and personal. And your voice is great in reading these books. It is kind of clear, I feel like, compared to other authors that I've read, that you're reading a James Renner book.
Thanks. I like talking to the reader, and especially with this book, it was super personal, and I was very aware of the reader the whole time. And there are a couple places in the book where I directly address the reader and warn you, in places like, this is what you're getting into, this is what's in store, because it can be, I hate the word triggering, but it can be, there's a lot in this book that is triggering. And I'm clear about that up front. You don't have to read this book, but there's a lot of interesting things in it if you want to take the journey.
So there's this part in your last book, Little Crazy Children, where you tell this really personal story about a tree falling on your car and your daughter's in the car. And I remember, and I might have told you this already, but I just want to reiterate. I remember I was listening to that and I was doing yard work, and I just stopped in the middle of doing yard work. I was just standing in the backyard just with my mouth open like, oh my God. And it was the way you read that. And I don't have kids, so I couldn't even relate on that level. But anyone in that position, the experience that you had in that moment, you conveyed it so well, and then you took that feeling and you put it into Scout Camp, which is why I'm saying it's such a harrowing experience to read this book, and it's called Scout Camp. Can you
Sure.
I mean, we all know Boy Scout Camp is what we're talking about.
Yes. So just a little, background on what you had mentioned, just real quick, that story, a 300-year-old oak tree fell on my car when my daughter was inside. And what I was trying to, with Little Crazy Children, it was about the unsolved murder of Lisa Pruitt, and talking about her parents who had lost a kid, and thank God I've never lost a kid, but there was a moment where I legitimately felt I had. when this tree fell down, and I looked up and I couldn't see the Subaru. It was just covered in this underneath this tree, and it looked like it had been smushed flat with my daughter inside. And so there was about I'd say 30 seconds there where I was sure I lost my kid, and it was the worst feeling in the world. And so that's what they're feeling forever, and it's hell. So that's why I brought it up, and so I took that kind of personal storytelling, and it's all throughout Scout Camp. This is a book that I knew I was going to write one day, and I wasn't for a while mature enough to write it, or ready to write it. And because it is about my experience inside the Boy Scouts, and it's also about the greater story about the abuse scandal inside the Boy Scouts. And it hasn't been properly reported, the scale of it yet. To everybody, makes connections to the abuse scandal in the Catholic Church. But at the height of the abuse scandal in the Catholic Church, at least in the United States, there were 11,000 victims who filed suit against the Catholic Church. And with the Boy Scouts, there were 82,000 victims that filed suit in this giant lawsuit that led to the bankruptcy of the organization. So it's at a scale that's exponentially larger than the Catholic Church. And in some ways that makes sense because, Catholicism is limited to Catholic churches, where Boy Scout troop buildings and meetings are non-denominational. So they're connected with, not just the Catholic Church and Christian churches, but Mormons and any other religion that wants to sponsor them. So it's all over the place. There were some serious lack in oversight in the Boy Scouts for almost 100 years. And I also wanted to explain where the Boy Scouts came from and the weird history behind it. And then all these secret societies that operate inside of it. And then the personal story about when I was a camp counselor at the biggest Boy Scout camp in Ohio back in 1995, when one of the counselors sexually assaulted another counselor, a friend of mine, and then went home and ended up dead under mysterious circumstances. So it was kind of the first big mystery in my life, and certainly had an impact on where I ended up in true crime.
Wow. Well, can you tell us a little bit about the background of the Boy Scouts organization?
Yeah, it's super interesting. And, one of the reasons I like writing about these books is the opportunity to learn the history of some of these things that most people don't think about or we take for granted. And the Boy Scouts was no exception. The Boy Scouts was founded by this guy, Robert Baden-Powell, who, once you look into his history, a lot of what happened to the Boy Scouts makes a little sense. He was England and, Great Britain consider Baden-Powell a war hero. Other people would consider him they would not put him on a pedestal. He was involved in what's called the Boer Wars. So he was like in Africa, and it was when South America was fighting against imperialism. It had to do with the discovery of oil, of course, and or not just oil, but gold. The discovery of the largest underground cache of gold on the planet, and so this war happened around it. Baden-Powell was an officer with the British Army and kind of holed up and protected this city called Mafeking, and there, he meets up with this young officer who everybody describes him as he looked like a girl, this short very young officer, and the two of them would play the parts of women in plays that Baden-Powell would write for to perform in front of his troops. And eventually those two moved in together, and the biographers that have written about Baden-Powell are hesitant to say that this was a a complete homosexual relationship. Not that there's anything wrong with that either, but it certainly seems to me like it was. And he, would gift this young man scarves. They had a pet pig named Algernon. They acted like a couple. And when they got back after the war, this young man ended up marrying a woman, and that just made Baden-Powell very upset. He took the ideas that he learned in the Army and created the Scouts in England, and it took off right away and was pulled into the States and became the Boy Scouts of America. But later on, it becomes very alarming. Baden-Powell used his position as kind of the chief executive of the Scouts and would write to boys and ask them, about their masturbation habits. And, there was in the official Boy Scout handbook, the first edition, there's a passage about masturbation. And, he talks about working it up in your hand and, warns against doing it because it could lead to, a mental deficiency. And he's very obsessed with this idea. And then later on, as an old man writing to young boys about the subject. And meanwhile, the first generation of Scoutmasters are sometimes writing him and saying, hey, I want to talk to my Scouts about this issue. Wouldn't it be better to kind of guide them through this? And really creepy stuff very early on. And Baden-Powell, as the head of it, was involved with it too, and didn't put a stop to it then. And then it continued for 100 years after that. So that's kind of the history. It's the scouting was based. It was founded by a guy who I believe we consider a war criminal now, and closeted homosexual who very likely had attraction to young boys, and that's where they started.
It started off successfully overseas, you said, in Britain, and then it took off successfully in the United States. Was it the idea that there was an organization that could mold the minds of young men and boys that was appealing and train them to be productive in life?
That's exactly right. The Boy Scouts was founded in America in 1910, I believe. And, when you dive into the history, you realize that as much as things change, the more they remain the same. Back in 1910, as in recent years, everybody was really scared that our country was becoming too liberal too fast. And it had to do with taking the kids out of the fields and out of the mines and putting them into schools. You don't have to work anymore. You can go to school and be a kid. And everybody lost their minds because now they're in schools and they have all this extra free time where they're not working, and they're getting into trouble. So the Boy Scouts was founded in part to instill conservative values to this generation of kids that they thought were becoming too liberal. So, it was specifically, a way to indoctrinate generations of boys into more conservative, Christian-based behavior.
But also at the same time teaching them survival skills and things like that.
Yeah, my best and worst memories are in the Boy Scouts, and some of the lessons that I learned in Boy Scouts, I really helped me. It made me very self-reliant, and so there are some really good things about it. Some of the things that you teach these kids, even the fun little things like you mentioned, building a fire and cooking and organizing a menu and, orienteering, going out and finding, the compass bearings and just understanding your world and getting in touch with nature. all of that's wonderful. And I think, not to jump too far ahead, but I think the Scouts can survive. They're no longer even called the Boy Scouts. It's called Scouting America now. And I think that what's gonna save it is letting what they did, I think about 10 years ago now, which is letting in women. Girls can now be Eagle Scouts, and women can now be Scoutmasters and leaders. And that just puts in a very simple check and balance to, if there's a woman leader in the troop, these predators are going to have a lot harder time separating these boys or girls at this point and getting into trouble. 99% of these crimes are committed by men. And so the women are there to keep an eye on things, which is great. And they can still teach these wonderful skills. The other thing that's got to change in scouting that I am amazed has not changed yet is the number of secret societies that exist inside the scouting, and specifically at these summer camps that the kids are sent away to every year.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
Yeah, can we explore that topic a little bit further? These secret societies that have been generated from Boy Scouts?
Yeah. You start talking about it and you sound like a conspiracy theorist. Anytime you say secret society, it's like, come on. But this is kind of a big deal. And, everybody that's in Scouts kind of knows about this organization called the Order of the Arrow, where if you are a really good scout, you're selected and you go out. Order of the Arrow is the most tame of these, what they call honor societies. And all that you do with that is you go through a little ceremony. There's a trial, a test of your skill where you're sent out the night before. And back in my day, you were sent out with a single match and a hard-boiled egg. And you were sent out on your own, and you had to find a place to make a fire and shelter and stay warm for the night. And then they'd collect you in the morning. And that showed that you were a real man. And then you got the Order of the Arrow badge. But there are much more dangerous and unofficial, although they do seem pretty official, absolute secret societies in scouting. And at the summer camp I worked at, 7 ranges in central Ohio, there was a huge secret society called Pipestone. And on Friday nights, they would gather scouts together and you would go through this Pipestone ceremony. And it starts when you're a tenderfoot. So you've got kids as young as 11 years old that they lead across the street after it gets dark and into the woods that up till then it's the forbidden woods. You're not supposed to go in there. And they lead you down these trails. And the first thing they do is take you to this little meadow. And at the bottom of this hill is this great bonfire. And the Scoutmasters drop their kids off and then they disappear. So we're left alone. And I was 11 years old when I went through this in 1989. And you're left alone and you're supposed to sit there quietly with your arms folded and you watch the fire for over an hour. And the fire slowly burns down to embers. At that point, all of a sudden, these what I thought were authentic Native Americans that I later learned were just middle-aged white guys who had painted their skin red, wearing nothing but loincloths, jump out of the woods, pull the kids up, and march them through the woods. Not march, but run. You run through the woods through these winding trails that are overexposed roots and down valleys, and you end up at another ceremonial ring deep inside the forest. And this is going to sound made up, but there are pictures in the book where I show these things. There are poles. It's kind of circular in shape. And on these poles are the skulls of dead animals. And at the center of the circle is another bonfire. And behind the bonfire is is the Indian chief. And I call them Indians because we called them Indians at the time. It's total cultural appropriation. But this Indian chief is sitting behind the fire, and he's got a bunch of like helpers around him. And one by one, they take the participants, these boys, through the ceremony. And the first year ceremony, one thing you have to do is they hand you a clamshell full of liquid, and they tell you to drink it. And if you spit it out, you have to go back to the back of the line, or you're just kicked out. You don't get your pipestone. But I learned later what was that liquid is Bittrex, which is what they put in antifreeze, so kids don't drink it. It's a super bitter solution. When you drink it, it puckers your mouth, and you want to spit it out, but you swallow so you get through the ceremony. And at the end, you have to kneel in front of the chief. So I'm pretty short at age 11, and I kneel, so I'm in between this guy's legs, and he pulls out a human skull, and inside the skull is a little light, and at the back of the skull is the password for year 2 of Pipestone. There are 5 years of this, and so the password for year 2 was secrecy. And you have to remember that to go through the next course. And then at the end, the chief every year gives a speech. And that year was that first year, again, 11, 12-year-olds, the chief is telling you about the importance of secrecy as you grow older. And sometimes there are secrets that are good to keep from your parents, your father, your mother and father. And so that's how they begin this. And, very pointedly, the first lesson you learn is about secrecy, and you're not supposed to ever talk about Pipestone to anybody that hasn't gone through the ceremony, including your parents. At least that's how it was back in '89. And Pipestone ceremony still goes on today at 7 ranges. I'm hoping the book, might bring at least an end to that.
So Pipestone still happening today at 7 ranges. Still loincloths, men in loincloths dressed up like Native Americans with little boys around?
Yeah. And after you go through all 5 years, you are then invited to participate in Pipestone. So you can get your 5th Pipestone around age 15, 16. And then on Friday night, you can go help put on Pipestone. And in 1995, when I got my 5th year Pipestone, I was invited over. And so I got to see behind the scenes, and I got to see the big shower house. There's a secret shower house across the road from camp. And back then, to get ready for the ceremony, they would have a nice spaghetti dinner. And the adult men would stand around naked with the boys as young as 15. And eat their spaghetti, and then we would take turns painting each other's bodies with this red paint. And then at the end of the night, we all shower together. So it's, I think if parents were aware of some of the things that were going on then, it might not have lasted as long as it has. And it just blows my mind that I know they've made changes. I don't know to what degree. The biggest concern for me was the speech that the chief gives for the 4th year students. So now we're talking ages, 13, 14 years old, where the speech begins, or at least at the time, verbatim, this is how it began. Masturbation leads to curiosity. Leave your friendships with other boys behind, and it was a speech about the dangers of masturbation, the dangers of homosexuality, how it was all a sin, and how it was up to you to maintain your integrity and to stop being a juvenile and grow up.
Now, you said we showered together and we would paint each other. Did you take part in this?
I don't think I ever painted anybody's backside, but a friend of mine who was a little younger than me, so he must have been about 15 that summer, was approached in the shower, and also was approached to help paint a leader's body. But there was also a guy, the guy that they had in charge of youth protection for Pipestone was a guy named Jim Mills, and I can use his name because he's
I'm sorry,
dead.
we have to go back to the irony. What? Youth protection?
Yes,
okay.
Yes. They had a member. This guy Jim Mills was in charge of youth protection for Pipestone. I don't know how he got in that role, but Pipestone was Friday night, so Saturday we'd all clean up, and then Mills would invite a select group of boys. And one year I was part of that group, and he would bring us into a sweat lodge that was hidden off to the side of the forest line, and ask us to take our clothes off, and then we would climb inside the sweat lodge, and he would ogle us as the time went on in this sweat lodge. We got all sooty. And then afterwards, we'd go to his creepy camper van, and he'd hold up a gravity shower, and one by one we'd clean the soot off of us, and then get dressed. And he, along the way, he'd make comments about our dicks, and very overt kind of things going on there. Luckily, he never physically came after me, but during the course of researching this book, it became apparent that he had assaulted a number of those boys, including one that was in the sweat house with me that day, and also assaulted that counselor who went crazy and ended up dead that summer, and continued his predation after that death and after that summer, and just wrecked the lives of I don't even know. I don't even know what the number is, but a generation of scouts in that area who went on to then hurt other people. And that's who they had in charge of youth protection at Pipestone. So, basically what I wanted to do with this story is tell the story. You've got 82,000 victims, at least 82,000 perpetrators. And I told this story is about one, and the ripple effects that it had and the deaths that it led to, including Mill's own, and the fallout that is lasting, to this day. I have friends that have not recovered from that summer. And, this is just one, so there are 81,999 stories just like this.
So you've had friends who haven't recovered, and when you read your book, you come very close to not recovering. I mean, you'll never recover, you'll always have those memories. Can you talk about the PTSD?
Yeah, the book you mentioned that I hooked you in the first couple pages, which I love to hear about. It is super, super personal. The book opens with me being admitted into the psychiatric unit in Akron. I get into it was that experience that kind of led me to take a real accounting of my life and figuring out, why I act. For want of a better word, why I act crazy sometimes, and that began this experience and journey, and led that. When I got out of the, I was only there for a couple nights, and when I got out, I tweeted about my hope that I would become sober, that I would go on the sobriety journey, and one of the counselors that I worked with that summer reached out over Twitter and it's like, hey man, I've gone through the same thing, and just want to say I'm here. So it was an old friend reaching out, and so I met up with him and we talked, and I said, look, I think I'm looking back on my life, and I think it's time to write this book about what happened that summer. And I really thought he would shut it down. Who wants to relive some of the crazy stuff that happened there? But he, we're now old enough where he's like, yeah, you should do it. So that was a lot of help. And he and another friend of mine who was on staff that summer. They really helped with the book and read early drafts of it, and we were very open with each other about what was going on. And it was a wild journey, and I think the act of writing the book was very helpful. I'm in a really good place now that I never thought I'd get to, and I think it's because I reconnected with those friends, and we talked about the shared trauma and what went on, and it led me to some really interesting experiences because of this. I got to testify in front of the Ohio State Congress, the Ohio State House, on a bill that took away the statute of limitations for sex crimes against children. It got rid of it for a 2-year grace period so that the victims of the Boy Scout leaders in our state could get their full compensation from the bankruptcy. So, one victim, and it's really weird. You go on this is the official Boy Scout site, and they have a calculator for victims to plug in their information. And it will spit out the number, it will spit out what you're going to get from the settlement. And so, there's a certain amount that they give for blowjobs. There's a certain amount they give you for rim jobs. There's a certain amount they give you for full penetration. So just the calculus of that is so banal and cold. It's like, how do you break that down into numbers? Well, they figured out a way to do it. And in Ohio, because of the way our laws read, because of the statute of limitations, one victim I talked to was going to get like $40,000 or something. And, for like being raped by his scoutmaster. And, now that we've gotten rid of that statute of limitations, I think he's getting 6 figures. I think it's somewhere close to like $400,000. So, I was very happy to help with that. I testified and really, met with a number of these other victims, and we formed kind of a support group, and they certainly went through a lot more than I did. I was more witness to a lot of these things, but it still affected me. So I can't imagine the effect that it had on them. And then, as a way of healing, we've got these 82,000 victims, but nothing, and they're going to get some money. But nobody's addressed how we help them psychologically long term. So that was another thing that I wanted to research, and that led me to experimenting with psychedelics. And I got connected with a lobbyist in DC who's trying to make MDMA and psilocybin legal for therapy, because it's the only thing that's ever been shown to cure PTSD, and not just a few people. It's like over the course of, after you've had this psilocybin or MDMA therapy, they show a 66% success rate in curing PTSD in people over the course of a year, because there's an immediate effect, and then there's a long-term effect. It kind of just resets your brain and allows you to see things subjectively for the first time and get rid of those patterns of thought. So I connected with a healer in DC and tripped balls with him one night in his apartment in DC, and had a wild experience. And it left me with some immediate effects of just being able to get rid of some of my ego. I can't get rid of it all. It's just too big. But but it also had like long-term lasting effects. I've tried all sorts of ways to limit my drinking. I was at a point where, I could have one drink, but if I had two drinks, I'd have 10 drinks, That had an immediate effect where that craving went away. And then, I'm at a place now where I might have a drink, once a week. But when I drink, it's like no more than 2, and it's not every day anymore. And there were years where, I was just drunk 12 hours a day, and literally every day for like 2 years. So this book is definitely, I won't say saved my life, but it's definitely really helped.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
When I said before you came really close to not recovering, you did. Like you were teetering there.
Oh, yeah.
And it was really fascinating to find out this idea, or this proven, I guess, therapy with MDMA. Can you just open that up a little bit? Like, what is MDMA? And there's a line in your book where you said, and then Reagan came into office and ruined it. So, yeah, just a little bit of history there.
Yeah. MDMA is, the street name is Molly McButter, maybe just Molly. So psychedelics were not this evil thing until Reagan came in and Nancy went to her psychic and discussed these ideas to have this war on drugs. And that made psychedelics, they put it on the list of dangerous drugs. And up until then, we were just at a point where we were starting to see the real benefits that it had on PTSD victims coming back from Vietnam. It was like a wonderful thing and could have helped that entire generation. And then it became this, another drug in their war on drugs. But before that, I get into the history of AA a little bit. I'm here in Akron where AA was founded. And, one of the founders of AA wanted to make psychedelics the 13th step, and was very close to doing that because he found it to be extremely helpful, because it does help you reset that compulsion and that urge to always be drinking, and realize that could also help a lot of people. So, but then it was made illegal and has been since then. It's starting to open up a little bit. It is decriminalized in DC and Portland and I think Ann Arbor maybe now. But a few places have decriminalized it. And, there are lobbyists like the one I met with, and this organization called MAPS that is trying to make it available for veterans coming back. And, so I think I think it's going to happen. I think it might be, a few more years, but I think it's going to happen the same way that legalization of marijuana happened, a step at a time until everybody kind of just, relents. And, unfortunately, one way that they're convincing Congress to make it legal is they're like, hey, you got all these people coming back from these wars that are psychologically damaged and can never fight again. How would you like it if we could figure out a way to get them back on the front lines? And, one way is to do the psychedelic therapy, fix them, and then they can go back for another tour. So that suddenly becomes interesting for even the conservative side of Congress.
Can you tell us a little bit about this guy, Mike Klingler, who you write about in the book?
Yeah. So Mike Klingler was the guy that ended up dead the summer of 1995. And I first knew Mike Klingler as the camp program director back in like 1993, which is like, if you go to summer camp, the program director is like Johnny Carson or David Letterman or, I guess nowadays Jimmy Fallon or Kimmel. And, he's like a celebrity. He's in charge of all the fun at camp. He was the director this summer, and just so happened that summer there were a lot of fires around camp that were unexplained. The trading post where you could buy slushies and combos and snacks burned to the ground one night and could have burned the whole camp down. But you got scouts that are ready to go with their water buckets and were able to contain it. So but somebody could have died that night. And it was always this rumor in camp that these were arson fires, and they weren't able to figure out who it was. So when I became a counselor in 95, I was 17 years old, and I wanted to figure out the mystery of Seven Ranges, which is who was setting all these fires. And that summer, Klingler was back, but he wasn't program director. He had been like demoted. He was in charge of this frog program or something, or maybe he was just in charge of the CITs, which are counselor in training, which I was. I wasn't a counselor in training because I taught first aid, but I was with that group because it was my first year as staff. And he had this big tent in our little tent community and would kind of look after us. And so I remember asking him a little bit about the fires back then and who he thought might have done it. And he just kind of shrugged and, he's like, oh, it must have been squirrels or something. But I always had this weird feeling about him. I think I talk about this a little bit about in the book, but I think attractive boys like women understand the way that a man can look at you and have intention in their eyes. And every time I talked to Klingler, I got that just that he was admiring me and wanted something more. He would make comments about my ears and, my appearance. And there was a time where I was sitting with a group of kids teaching first aid, and they were doing something else with CPR, and I was just kind of almost dozing. And I feel somebody caressing my ear. And there was a girl on staff that summer, and I thought it was her at first, and I got really excited. And I turn around, and it's Klingler. And, I'm 17. This guy's like, I don't know, 25. He's also a teacher on the off season. He taught elementary. So it was the next day after that a friend of mine, another staff member, in the morning, I'm at breakfast, and the staff member walks in, and his face is just ashen. I've never seen that before, like gray. And I knew right away that like the hair in the back of my neck stood up. I'm like, he's not okay. But he wouldn't talk to any of us. He wouldn't tell us what happened. Eventually, one of the staff adults in charge was able to take him to a safe place and get him to tell the story. What came out was that night before, Mike Klingler sexually assaulted him he had taken a group of boys out for like an overnight in the wilderness, and Klingler showed up, pulled him out of this Adirondack, they call it. It's this little shelter, and took him behind a tree and sexually assaulted him, and then physically assaulted him and left him there. And he made it back to camp and then told his story. And so then the adult leaders go and confront Klingler. Klingler then goes home. And the next thing we know, early the next morning, they gather us together. And the camp director tells us that Klingler is dead and that it appears that he died by suicide. After going home, he knew the police were coming and shot himself. Later on, about 10 years later, out of curiosity, I was working as a reporter at the time. I went to the coroner and pulled the autopsy report because the questions arose. Because we were at first told that it was suicide. And then a couple hours later, we were pulled together again and said, we might have this wrong. Now they're saying it was an accident, that he was shooting at cans and there was a ricochet and it hit him and killed him. Even then I knew it was BS. So, but eventually I pulled the autopsy report and I speak to the coroner down there, and he says that he had to rule it undetermined, not because it was a ricochet, but because he could not determine whether it was murder or suicide. And so one of the central mysteries of this book is trying to figure out if Klingler was murdered or if he did die by suicide. And if he was murdered, who had the means, motive, and opportunity. So, this book is full of little mysteries like that wrapped around each other.
Yeah, that's a crazy mystery for sure. And you take yourself down these paths that you have to revisit so many years later, and you tell a lot of personal items. You tell a lot of personal stories about yourself. What did you have to do to get past the, I guess, apprehension of talking about these personal stories and knowing that they'd be out there?
I think being old enough to not care anymore. I think literally that's it. I'm now old enough where, I don't care about any sort of fallout from this, for telling the truth about what happened to us. I think it's important. I went into it trying to figure out what happened to Klingler, and it became the damage that was done at that camp was so much greater than what I expected. And once I opened the door and people started talking, they led me to other people and other victims and more victims and more victims. And a lot of this does stem from that Jim Mills, who was a part of Pipestone, because he definitely had an abusive relationship sexually with Mike Klingler, and made him, I think, who he became. There was still a little bit of humanity in Klingler. Not much, but it was there. Mills was gone. Mills was just a predator. Mills ends up dying too. And again, it's ruled suicide, but I have my doubts on Mills now, more so than I had on Klingler. So there's a mess of death and abuse that happened that reverberates from that summer. And what's interesting when I talk about Klingler, and I talk about this in the book a little bit, there's definitely still a trauma response that goes on in my brain where it kind of shuts it down, because I had like 2 or 3 points I wanted to talk to you about that. But as soon as we start talking about them, it disappears. And one of the weirdest things that came out of researching this again was when I spoke to other friends at camp, and they're like, you disappeared, right? And I was like, what are you talking about? Because I don't have much memory of the days following Klingler's death. And I eventually had to call my dad and get him to explain to me that I called him at camp and had him pick me up. And I went home and just essentially laid in bed for 3 days processing. And then I went back to camp and kind of compartmentalized it and went away. But I have no memory of those 3 days. So there's definitely a weird trauma response that happens. One thing that I did want to mention is I do end up finding out that Klingler, in fact, was the arsonist of that camp too. So it was, not that anything in this book is fun, but I think there are funny moments throughout, as much as there can be, but it was at least rewarding for me to solve that mystery that I was so interested in when I was 17.
Now, I know this question isn't directly about your book, but I'm just curious. Do the Girl Scouts have issues like the Boy Scouts have?
No.
This is crazy.
No, and there's a simple reason for that. They're the Girl Scouts and not the Boy Scouts. Men commit these crimes. Women generally don't, and, there's always that person, well, what about that story? Yeah. 1 in 1,000, women will do something like this, but the majority of it happens, because of men and this aggressionness and this testosterone that whatever it is. This just doesn't happen at Girl Scout camp to the extent that it does happen at Boy Scout camp, which is why I think, the only way that scouting can survive is what they're doing, which is bringing women into the program to watch all the men.
You thanked your mom and dad at the end of the book. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So another big part of this book is about the abuse that I went through, not sexually. Well, I guess there is some of that in there too, but mostly physical abuse at the hands of my stepmother at the time. And, she was in my life from the age of like 5 to about 18. I lay it all out there in what happened. And it was a hard thing to talk about. And it's bringing up a lot of, I don't know that I'd call them secrets, but a lot of stories that my family doesn't probably really want out there. So I had to have these awkward discussions with my siblings and my father and my mother. And so I wanted to, I wanted to let them know at the end of the book, how much I do love them. I was unprotected because of the fact that I had little supervision and was unprotected. I was a victim of abuse for many years. But I can't fault them, really. They had me when my mom got pregnant when she was 18. They had me when they were 19. They were divorced by the time I was 3. They went on and each had families of their own. They each got married to abusive people. I'm 46 now, and I'm imagining what it would be like to start a family at the age of 18, and you just can't do it. You're until you're 25, your brain's not fully developed. You're still a crazy little kid. And, to add a child onto that, I think they did the best they can. And, they certainly love me, and I wanted, after talking about these things, I wanted to let them know that I appreciate the things that they did do for me. They did teach me some great lessons. My father raised me. I'd see my mother every other weekend. And so I was raised out in the country, out in the sticks, but my mother lived in the city. And what she did was introduce me to culture. So she'd take me to symphonies and take me to the library. And that's where I got my love of reading and film and music. And my father would teach me hard lessons out in the country, teach me lessons about how to overcome fear. And one of the lessons he taught me was about fear was, I would bring these library books home from my mom's, and they were about aliens and monsters. And then I couldn't sleep at night. I'd be up all night. And he'd try to explain to me, there's nothing to be afraid of. And so one day he said, okay, I'm taking away your books until you can show that you can get over this fear. And what I want you to do is walk to the end of our property. And we lived on a farm, so it's like out in the woods. Go to the end of the property and then come back and alone. And it's, it's a good half-mile walk into the deep, dark woods. And not just that, but we had literally Indian burial mounds, Native American mounds in our backyard, like they're old graveyards. And we were always scared to go those, and you had to pass them to get to the edge of our property. So, I'm like, I'll show my dad. I'm going to go out and, get murdered by these Native American spirits, and won't he feel bad? So I walked into the woods. I was probably 8 years old, 9. Once I got back there, nothing happened. I'm like, well, I can go a little further. And then nothing more happened. I'm like, I can go a little further. And I went all the way to the end of the property and then came back. And by the time I got back, he was scared. He's like, you didn't really have to go so far. I was just trying to prove a point. And he did. And, I haven't really been scared of monsters and aliens, at least since then. So they taught me good lessons in their own ways. And I didn't want them to think that I was unappreciative of the good things that happen.
Also, doesn't that strike you as like a perfect metaphor for your writing?
Yeah. I learned a lot of things about why I do what I do during the course of writing this book. Yes, I think it's a metaphor for overcoming fear, and it helps the writing. And, going into these places, with the Maura Murray case or Amy Mihalovic, that, where you're meeting serial killers or people that can harm you, and being able to do that and not be afraid definitely helped me. It also became very clear that probably the driving reason why most of my books are about missing women is because my mother disappeared when I was 3 years old, and I didn't see her for a long time. And she still kind of disappears on me every once in a while. But there was this urge in me at 3 or 4 where I was looking for this woman. And so obviously, you don't have to be a shrink to see the connection there.
And your mom came back.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah. Yep. She's doing well. Yeah, she's and she ended up having 3 more girls, my sisters.
Before we hit record on this conversation, I'm just going to change gears at the end of this conversation because I feel like we could use a good laugh at this point. You mentioned that it had been several years since we all went to Canada together, and that puts things into perspective as far as time frames. In reality, it was 2013.
Yeah.
So
I thought we were coming up on our 10th anniversary, but it's 12 years. It's been 12 years since we went to try to find Maura Murray in Canada.
Like, how is that possible that so much time has gone by? The reality of that is tough for me to comprehend.
It is. Yeah. It's great. And like, the reason I was thinking about that, when you're in the shower or you're getting ready in the morning, for some reason our brains bring up like the cringiest things that have ever happened. And you're like, oh, why did I do that? And I remember being in Quebec City or maybe Montreal looking for Maura, and I had it in mind that I wasn't going to offend anybody there, and I would speak their native language. But I don't know any French. So, all I knew was, how do you say, and then I'd say something in English. So it was like, voulez-vous français eggs? And, or, have you, I don't know. But like, and it just annoyed everybody in hindsight. I remember talking to one maitre d', and I'm like, rah, 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 rah. And he's like, just talk in English. Just talk English. And, so I don't know why I was trying to speak French when I don't know any French.
And one of the things I laugh about is how we printed up a bunch of flyers in English. And it never occurred to us to print up flyers in French.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
I didn't think of that until years later. And I was like, oh, that feels a little counterproductive.
Otherwise, I'm sure we would have solved the case.
Probably, most definitely. But
that was a fun trip, though. I do have fond memories of that trip and getting to know you guys and Josh. I also remember like getting to Quebec City and it being, I don't know if you remember this, the temperature, the thermometers were saying -40. And the only reason I remember that, I mean, with the wind or whatever, the only reason I remember that is it's the number where Fahrenheit and Celsius align. And I'm like, well, it's -40 in both countries. It's that cold. And I don't know how anybody lives there, let alone like 1 million people.
Yeah, I remember questioning why I didn't bring a hat. we're walking on the street like it was just frozen.
Yeah.
We definitely could have dressed warmer, especially in Quebec City, walking around the downtown with the wind whipping. Yeah, that was not pleasant. But
No.
wonderful town. Great.
Is it?
Great,
is it though?
I mean,
No,
except
it
for the
is.
cold, it's fine.
We're in a safe space. We can speak the truth here.
You're gonna look at your numbers for the podcast, and there's you've lost the viewers in Quebec City and Montreal.
Yeah, there'll be a dip in numbers. Well, James, what a fantastic, honest, brutal book you wrote, and
Thank you.
And I say that in the best possible way. And if you want to let people know again when it's coming out and where they can pick up a copy, and you also do the you're going to be doing the audio version as well.
Yeah. No, thank you for having me on. This is the first time I've got to talk about this new book, and I'm super interested in how it's going to be received. The book's called Scout Camp: Sex, Death, and Secret Societies Inside the Boy Scouts of America, based on the novel Push by Sapphire. And it comes out February 25th, everywhere that you get your books, in bookstores. If they don't have it in the bookstore, tell them they have to order like 10 copies because it's going to be a hit. And it'll be available as an audiobook and online everywhere. I'm going to do a little tour of the Midwest in the first week of March. Check out jamesrenner.com for times and locations, but I'll be hitting Des Moines and down to Wichita and everywhere in between.
All right, here we are back here for final thoughts after the conversation with James Renner about his new book, Scout Camp. Certainly a bit of a departure in James Renner's writing, subject-wise, not so much about how personal he gets with his writing, but yeah, this one is definitely eyebrow-raising with some, that personal insight he puts in there.
And it's also a really interesting and revealing element to our relationship with James Renner. And I say our, but I mean like you and I, plus the listeners and the true crime community who know James Renner. It's very revealing, especially when he says something in the interview like, I've been looking for reasons why sometimes, for lack of a better word, I act crazy. And everything has like a source. Everything has an origin. And after you read Scout Camp, a lot of the head-scratching behavior that sometimes we've seen James Renner be a part of, there's some answers in here. There's some answers, and it's not directly related, sometimes not directly related to the abuse at Scout Camp, but other things that he writes about. I don't know if he didn't see what he saw or the things that happened to him in Scout Camp, if they didn't happen or if he didn't see them, would he have still become somebody who's struggling with a drinking problem? I don't know. But I'm sure that this didn't help. I'm sure this contributed to any sort of substance abuse problem or behavioral issue that he feels he has. And it's not uncommon. I mean, he sent out one tweet about getting out of a psychiatric facility, and an old friend from Scout Camp reached out, and that's the decision that person made, to reach out to James to say, hey, I was in the same situation, I can support you. And that was the catalyst for writing the book, because he needed somebody who had gone through what he went through, came out a better person, and sort of, I don't know, lended his support and his backing for this book. But anyway, my long point is, like, every time James Renner writes a book, a little bit more insight goes into his personal past and his, I guess, decision-making process and maybe mistakes that he acknowledges that he made.
Yeah, it's very interesting. His thought process in storytelling, but also this story, and it's a larger problem, and a weird one, right? Like, I had never heard of secret societies inside the Boy Scouts of America. I don't think I ever knew a Boy Scout, like, growing up or anything like that. Like, as it was so removed from where I grew up, sort of in the mean streets of Medford, Massachusetts. Yeah, so some of that stuff, like the ruralness of, like, men hiding in the woods, like, I don't mean to laugh or make light of it, but, like, that's something I've never heard of, like that kind of ritual.
It's interesting that you bring that up, growing up, not having known anybody who was in Boy Scouts, and there was even one below that called Cub Scouts. There's like I don't know if it still exists, but the Cub Scouts and then the Boy Scouts. I think I knew one person, and it might have been a cousin of mine who was in Cub Scouts, and I don't know if they actually went into the Boy Scouts after, but for whatever reason, that was I missed out on those opportunities as well. Probably for the best, but the concept behind it is kind of a solid concept, right? You're training these boys, young men, to be organized, to appreciate work ethic, leadership.
Yeah, rank, respect.
Exactly.
Right, learn some outdoor capabilities.
Exactly. I mean, it just gives you these tools that you can then go into your adulthood with and hopefully be a better person. But it sounds like that was just a good mask to put over some really kind of sickly, perverted things that are still happening, like this pipestone thing.
Yeah, I'm very confused about this whole thing. definitely surprised to see that it is a thing that's like still out there, and you know, I don't know, decades of people, you know, boys have experienced this. Doesn't seem like a great exercise to me. Like, I'm not really sure where that falls in all the things we just described that are good about the Boy Scouts of America.
I don't see how that falls in that either. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really think it does. So, you know, and anytime someone takes aim at like sexual abuse, especially sexual abuse that is sort of organized in a certain way with tens of thousands of accounts, and, you know, you're kind of protected by the organization. Like, I'm all for that. You know what I mean? Like, this is that's the part that I can get passionate about with the work here that Renner's doing with this book. You know, I hope it actually leads to some eye-opening, you know, of the culture here.
You'd really hope so, because, again, going back to that pipestone thing, if grown men are still doing that, those are dangerous people. Because anyone in that situation, as a grown man surrounded by these boys, should understand how wrong and useless that exercise is.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you know, by choice, I suppose it's all fine. But if you're being forced there, or if it's just like a culture of like that, oh, that's how we do things because that's the tradition. You know, I'm confused by it. You know, and I certainly would never send any kids of mine into the Boy Scouts. I don't know. This is an uncomfortable story, and it's certainly uncomfortable territory. I feel like. Just to even talk about it at times. But again, that's the point of the book, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, James goes into such detail about what he experienced, which is, like you said, is very uncomfortable. And then the vulnerability that he shows when he is talking about his family and how he's behaving around them, when he's like sneaking these like drinks and, you know, his alcoholic behavior. I mean, it's all very like kind of stripped down, and you're out there. And, you know, he gave his family the option to not read this book until probably they're ready, you know, because it's going to be a tough one for them to revisit. Also, what kind of organization has this abuse that's so prevalent and so abundant that they need a calculator to estimate the types of payments that you can likely receive if you're awarded compensation for this? I mean, that's astounding.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, you're talking about some of the numbers there on that. I know survivingscouting.org has some of those numbers, like 82,000 people. And then there's information about the bankruptcy, which I haven't really looked into, but are they still up and running, the Boy Scouts?
The Boy Scouts are still up and running, according to James, that they did their bankruptcy procedures, I guess, and they're still a functioning organization. I couldn't tell you how many members they now have.
But we could tell you how many child sex abuse survivors are claimants on the bankruptcy, and that number is 82,209. Staggering.
I mean, that's unbelievable. I'm looking at the calculator. In case people thought that James was being hyperbolic about this, the calculator is right on the Boy Scouts of America website, or it's like an offshoot of the site. It's bsarestructuring.org, and then /estimated-potential-payment-calculator. And you can select your state, and you can select your abuse type. And then it'll estimate it and give you expedited distribution options, gives you the base value for the type of claim. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, it really is. So yeah, you know, definitely use the resources on those websites if you need to yourself, or know anyone who needs to. But yeah, it's a wild topic, and I'm glad we discussed it here today and with James. But I don't know what else to say, quite frankly.
Yeah, I'm with you. I never experienced something like this. I've only heard the, I guess, proven rumors, but I only heard the rumors at the time. And James is right. There wasn't a lot of reporting that was done on it in a serious fashion, like deep reporting on it. We would just hear the headlines about, this particular scoutmaster was suspected for abuse, and it never went into the detail that James goes into in Scout Camp, where he's talking about all these rituals and how they normalized a situation where, you're in a sweat lodge and the guy who is supposed to be protecting you is just naked in front of you. And these like moments, they don't go into those in any other type of reporting that I remember. So yeah, I guess what I have to say about it is I hope that this book opens up the door for more conversations and deeper reporting, and hopefully a complete restructuring and reorganization of the Boy Scouts program.
All right, everyone. Well, thanks a lot for listening here, and make sure to check out the book Scout Camp by James Renner. And you can get it on his site, jamesrenner.com, or your local bookseller. Thanks a lot for listening. We really appreciate it.